hope that all of you are doing well. I hope that you are all in good spirits, that you are healthy, and that you are ready to engage a really critical question relating to the idea, are we unique? Are we exceptional as human beings? And I want to say also how much I appreciate being partners with the RTB team. Our ability to contribute here in the US to the work of RTB even in a small way, is really an honor and a privilege. And it's an honor and a privilege for me to be able to spend time with you this evening talking about, again, this really critical question that gets to the heart of who are we as human beings, and can we actually defend the biblical perspective of human nature and human identity in an age that is influenced deeply by science and technology, in an age where AI is emerging, where we have an evolutionary framework that views human beings as really the product of evolution, not the handiwork of a divine creator. So those are the questions that we're going to wrestle with this evening. And I wonder if how many of you have experimented or even make use of generative AI technology. This technology is becoming increasingly accessible and available. Software packages like ChatGPT or Bard, and there's a number of generative AI technologies. And I can remember just a few years ago when these technologies were emerging on the scene, playing around with them a little bit and not being that impressed. But in recent months, this technology has grown in leaps and bounds, and it's really capable of doing some rather impressive things. On the other hand, when you utilize this technology, it starts to raise, at least for me, some really fundamental questions. Because as I interact with ChatGPT or with Bard, it almost feels as if these generative AI technologies could pass the Turing test. And this was a test developed by the pioneer, the father of modern day computer science, Alan Turing, to determine whether or not a machine has sentience, has self-awareness, should be regarded as a person, you might say. And Turing's test was something to this effect, that if your interaction with a machine is indistinguishable from your interaction with another human being, that you would have to argue that that machine actually should be granted the status of personhood, should be thought of as a person, should be could very well be understood as being sentient and self-aware. Now, there's a number of problems with the Turing test, because we now know that generative AI technologies are programmed in such a way to appear conversational, to be increasingly responsive to the way that we communicate and interact as human beings. So we, in a sense, we could argue that yes, indeed, it's indistinguishable interacting with an AI and a human. But on the other hand, we would also argue that there's still something fundamentally different between humans and AI systems. But nevertheless, we are rapidly approaching, given how quickly the technology is developing, to a point where you can begin to wonder, could AI systems actually develop sentience? Could they develop self-awareness, if you will? And if that's the case, should they be granted, personhood? And it's interesting along those lines. I believe it was the summer of 2017, if I'm not mistaken, when Saudi Arabia announced that Sophia would be granted citizenship in the country of Saudi Arabia. And Sophia, if you're not familiar, is a robotic system powered by AI technology developed by Hanson Robotics, which is headquartered, I believe, in Hong Kong. And the goal of Sophia is to create a robotic prototype that would be responsive to human emotions, where humans would connect with this machine at an emotional level. And the reason why these researchers want to do this is that there's a number of people around the world who are elderly, who are disabled, who are really locked in, who are isolated from other people and suffer mental illness, suffer negative health outcomes because they are isolated, because they don't have human contact. And so the idea here is that if we could create these robotic systems that people could connect with emotionally, that they would view as being another human being like them, that this would solve that problem of isolation. Now, all of this is happening, of course, in the context of a larger scientific milieu. But the idea of who we are as human beings is really a critical question that I think people are asking. And again, what does the Christian faith have to contribute to this conversation, to engaging this question? And there is a context for all of this. These questions are not just happening in a vacuum, and the context is one that already has raised questions about the biblical perspective on human identity and human nature. The prevailing view in the scientific world is that human beings are the product of an evolutionary history. And this idea really is pervasive in cultures all over the world, that we as human beings were not created by God, that we're not special or unique or exceptional in any way, but rather we, like all life on Earth, are the outcome of evolutionary history. And that the hominins that we see in the fossil record is evidence, is documenting this evolutionary ascent of man, which means that fundamentally there's nothing unique or exceptional about us as human beings, that everything that we think makes us unique and exceptional has its antecedents in these creatures that precede us in life's history, that these antecedents that we think are that describe human behavior are even found in animals as well, that there's nothing special about us. And this idea has shaped the study of human origins over the last 170 years and was really the theme of the book that launched the whole science of human evolution, The Descent of Man. This was a sequel, if you will, to Darwin's Origin of Species. And in the Origin of Species, Darwin was very careful not to address the question of human origins. But about a decade later, published a book, The Descent of Man, where he makes the argument that humans, like all life on Earth, have an evolutionary history. And in that, he writes these words, these famous words, in a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point when the term man ought to be used. And then he goes on to say this: the difference in mind between man and higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree, not kind. So in other words, that the idea here is that, again, there's nothing really exceptional about us. We're just part of this evolutionary web of life that we are only different in degree from in degree, not kind, from other creatures. And this idea that humans really are not unique compared to even the hominins is being challenged, or is being reinforced, I should say, by some recent work in Neanderthals. Neanderthals are hominins that predated modern humans, that predated us, that they emerged about 300,000 years ago, thereabouts, that they were primarily located in the Middle East and in Europe and in Asia. Evolutionary biologists think that Neanderthals and modern humans are on separate evolutionary branches, that we would have shared an evolutionary ancestor maybe 600, 700,000 years ago. And in recent years, there's been a flurry of papers published in the scientific literature that oftentimes are then discussed in the popular science outlets, that Neanderthals made art, they made jewelry, they made music, they possessed language, they buried their dead ritually, they mastered fire. The list goes on and on. In other words, that they were very much just like us in many, many respects. And that if indeed Neanderthals are like us, then that means that humans are not exceptional, that we're not unique. That means because either that unique capacity in humans and Neanderthals evolved independently, or that the common ancestor that humans and Neanderthals shared must have had these capabilities as well. And so this work seems to reinforce the notion that really there's nothing special about human beings. This is a little bit of an older journal article, but it gives you a sense for how many anthropologists view Neanderthals today. This is from an article published about a decade ago, but again, it really just illustrates the point that I want to make, where Villa and Robruck say, modern humans are usually seen as superior in a wide range of domains, including weaponry and subsistence strategies, which would have led to the demise of Neanderthals. This systematic review of the archaeological records of Neanderthals and their modern human contemporaries find no support for such interpretations, as the Neanderthal archaeological record is not different enough to explain their demise in terms of inferiority and archaeologically visible domains. They were really just like us. Now, there's also been some rather remarkable insights that have been gathered about animal behavioral capacities in recent years. Animal behavioralists are now drawing very reasonable conclusions about the intelligence and the emotional richness of animal lives, where they argue now that animals are far more intelligent than we necessarily would have thought originally, and that there's an emotional richness to their lives that we completely underestimated. In other words, that those qualities that we think that make us unique are actually present within animals as well, not just simply the hominins, but within animals as well. Nathan Lentz, who is an atheist, but also is somebody who I would consider a friend, who has appeared with RTB at workshops, representing kind of a dissenting voice from our particular perspective, in his book, Not So Different, said this: all the impressive human cognitive abilities evolved in ancestor species that already had an extensive palette of emotional states. In order to understand how our ancestors made the jump from animal behavior to human psychology, we must first recognize that the distance of that evolutionary jump is not as great as it seems. So the question really is, who are we as human beings? This question takes on urgency within our world today like never before. And regardless of one's worldview, people are asking this question, or they ought to be asking this question, really, who are we as human beings? Are we the product of an evolutionary history? Are animals really just like us? Are hominins like us? Are we really not unique and exceptional? Would it be arrogant to make that claim, to make that assertion, as some people have said? Are we guilty of speciesism, to regard other creatures as less or as inferior to humans? And then what about emerging technologies? AI systems, are they going to be like us as well? Right? And so these are really burning questions. And is there even a space for the biblical perspective of humans as being exceptional and unique, as being made in God's image? Is there even space for that perspective to have a credible voice in our world today in an age dominated by science and technology. So that's the question I'm going to address. And before I do that, I think it's really important that we take a moment and make sure that we're clear on what I mean when I use the term human. Now, scientifically speaking, the term human is actually an ambiguous term. You have to really pay attention to the context for how the term human is used in a scientific setting. Sometimes human is used to refer to hominins. These would be creatures like the Australopithecines, like Lucy, for example, the famous Lucy specimen, and Homo habilis and Homo erectus and Neanderthals. Anything that's considered a hominin is oftentimes referred to as human. Other times, human is used to refer to members of the genus Homo. So this would be Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and then modern humans, us. Sometimes human is used to refer to Homo sapiens. This would be creatures like not only us, but also Neanderthals and what are sometimes called the archaic Homo sapiens. And sometimes human is used to refer to Homo sapiens sapiens, or just exclusively us, or what would be known as anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. So the term scientifically is ambiguous. Theologically, not so much. Theologically, at least from a Christian theological perspective, I would say that the term human refers to anyone that bears the image of God. I would see human as being anyone who is a descendant of Adam and Eve, and I would take the view that Adam and Eve were real historical people, that they were the sole progenitors of all humanity, in that they gave rise to all human beings that are alive today, that have ever been alive throughout human history, and that because everyone is an Adam, we all are image bearers. So that's theologically how I would think of the term human. But scientifically, I would argue that modern humans, that anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, or Homo sapiens sapiens, is what I mean scientifically when I talk about the concept of human. And to me, there are good reasons for that. One is that if we all are in Adam, right, and if we are anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, each and every one of us, then it's reasonable to think Adam and Eve would have been so as well, and that the emergence or the appearance of Adam and Eve correlates with the appearance of anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. Also, as I've oftentimes heard, the Bible is written for us, but it was not written to us, if that makes any sense. In other words, there was an original audience that the biblical authors were writing that were going to receive the text that they had written. And the original audience that Moses, I believe, who is the author of Genesis, the original audience would have been people in a pre-scientific age in the ancient Near East, and that these people would have had no concept of hominins, of Neanderthals, or any other creature. They would have understood human to be essentially us. And so I think this makes the most sense to think about human scientifically as anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, and theologically as image bearers, as people that bear God's image. Okay, with that point of clarification in mind, the whole case against human exceptionalism hinges on this central question: are we different in degree or kind from other creatures? Are we different in degree or kind? And even though this idea that we really only differ in degree, not kind, from other creatures has shaped the science of human origins, have shaped anthropology and how people consider our relationship as human beings to other creatures, not only just the hominins, but other animals, even though that idea that we really are not that different, that any difference is only in degree, has been the prevailing view, in recent years, there are a growing number of anthropologists, evolutionary psychologists, animal behavioralists who are breaking ranks with that traditional view and are actually arguing, wait a minute, human beings really do indeed appear to be different in kind. Now, these people are not friends of the Christian worldview. They are operating within an evolutionary framework, but they're arguing, even within that evolutionary framework where we view human beings in strictly materialistic terms, there appears to be something that the data continually points to that suggests that modern humans stand apart from all other creatures, that we really are different in kind. And that one of those scientists who is advocating this view is a scientist by the name of Thomas Suddendorf. And in 2015, he published a book that I think is well worth getting a hold of if you can, called The Gap. And in this book, he makes an argument that modern humans are indeed fundamentally different from all other animals, that, or at least all other animals that are extant, that are alive today. And the subtitle of the book is The Science of What Separates Us from Other Animals. And in this book, Suddendorf writes these words: "We reflect on and argue about our present situation, our history, and our destiny. We envision wonderful, harmonious worlds as easily as we do dreadful tyrannies. Our powers are used for good as they are for bad, and we incessantly debate which is which. Our minds have spawned civilizations and technologies that have changed the face of the earth, while our closest living animal relatives sit unobtrusively in their remaining forests. There appears to be a tremendous gap between human and animal minds." Now, at one hand, you might say, well, this statement is self-evident, right? Is this really that profound? But when you think about this statement in the context of this framework that humans only differ in degree, not kind, what Suddendorf is saying here is incredibly radical, that he's breaking ranks with the Darwinian perspective, that he's breaking ranks with the mainstream anthropology community by saying the data really says that there's something fundamentally different about humans and chimpanzees, which are our closest, at least in an evolutionary sense, our closest evolutionary ancestors. That evolutionary biologists believe that humans and chimps about 6 million years ago shared an evolutionary ancestor. And that ancestor gave rise to two lineages. One of those lineages that culminates in modern humans has literally put human beings on the moon. The other lineage is a group of creatures that are on the verge of extinction, right? And that there must be something fundamentally different between humans and chimps in order to explain this, to account for this. Just this past year, or actually just a few months ago, Suddendorf published another book called The Invention of Tomorrow, where he continues making this argument for human exceptionalism and human uniqueness, where he says that humans seem to have a capacity that no other creature truly has, and that is the ability for mental time travel. In other words, what he means by that is that as human beings, we can remember the past, right? Other animals have memories of the past. But it's not that we just simply remember the past, but we can then replay the past. We can think about alternative scenarios. What if I made this decision instead of that decision? What would have been the outcome? Would the outcome have been different? And I can run through all these alternative scenarios about how things could have been different in the present if I made different decisions in the past. And through that exercise, I actually can learn about what would be the best decision in a similar circumstance. That this becomes insight and learning that I glean from essentially mentally traveling in time to alternate past sequences of events. Likewise, each human being can transport themselves into the future. And we can begin to imagine what the future might be like. That if we make certain decisions now leading into the future, how is that going to produce different types of futures? Which is the future that I most like, that I most apprize, that I want? And then how can I then take very deliberate steps to set goals to achieve that particular future, that I can invent the future, even though it's not happened, because of my capacity for mental time travel. And through this, not only can I learn, but I can actually engage in problem solving. That, again, Sudendorf argues that it's only humans that have this interesting capability. In the book, he writes, there's no compelling evidence that non-human species generate or communicate mental scenarios of remote future events, connect them into narratives, or reason about mutually exclusive versions of the future. Only humans appear capable of such feats. In other words, we even will debate with one another about different future scenarios and what are the decisions that we need to make. What are the steps we need to take to create those futures of our desire, and which is the best future? We debate these kinds of things. And this makes us different and unique as human beings. And when people fundamentally try to ascertain what is it about humans that give us these capabilities, they argue that it's a combination of four qualities: symbolism, our capacity to represent the world with symbols. This is the basis for language, for music, for art, for body adornment, jewelry use, for example, tattoos. All of these types of things are manifestations of symbolism. But not only can we represent the world with symbols, but we have this ability to manipulate those symbols. We can combine them and recombine them in different ways to create narratives, to create scientific theories and models. That this is the way in which we envision the future, and that we remember the past and we explore alternate pasts. We have theory of mind, where we recognize that others have minds like ours, and that we desire to connect to those minds, that we know what people are thinking and what they're feeling. We have insight into that, and that we want to create a network of minds where we collaborate together with other minds. And this leads to our ability to organize ourselves into very complex social hierarchical structures, and that human beings uniquely have this suite of capabilities that essentially make us unique, make us exceptional, that cause us to stand apart. Now, what's interesting to me is that these qualities could be understood as scientific descriptors for the image of God, right? That if you adopt a particular view of the image of God called structuralism, or the resemblance view, that you would argue that these qualities are in effect scientific terms and concepts that in effect are manifestations of the image of God, of the Imago Dei. And that we can then link this idea of human exceptionalism in a scientific context to the image of God concept in a theological context, which means that the evidence for human exceptionalism scientifically now can be evoked as evidence for the image of God. We can use it to make a scientific case that indeed human beings do bear God's image. Now, in addition to these qualities or these capabilities that human beings have that seem to cause us to stand apart from other creatures, there are also anatomical uniquenesses to modern humans compared to other hominins. Modern humans have a rather unusual skull and facial structure compared to other hominins. Our skull is globed shape. It's shaped like a globe. It's globular. And our face is flat and our chin is retracted. And this leads to an expansion in our brains of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Now, in comparison, Neanderthals and other hominins had an elongated skull. They had a face that jutted outward and a chin that jutted outward. And this forces a different brain shape. So even though Neanderthals had brains that were as large as ours, maybe even larger, the structure of the human brain and the Neanderthal brain is different, is different. And in fact, there was a study published a few years ago, and there have been follow-up studies since then that have explored similar things by creating virtual endocasts of the brain shape of, of hominins like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, other archaic Homo sapiens, and modern humans. You can determine that, again, the modern human brain is unique, that Neanderthals had a brain that was very similar to other archaic Homo sapiens like Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus. Their brain was just simply larger. It was just a little bit more of the same. But when modern humans appear on the scene, our brain is fundamentally different. And this leads to capabilities that really lend themselves towards symbolism, towards open-ended generative capacities. And these are just some of the qualities that you have enhanced by having an overdeveloped parietal and temporal lobe. And so, in fact, on this basis, there are a number of scholars who believe that modern humans were actually cognitively superior to Neanderthals, that we uniquely had the capacity for language, for mathematics, for art, for music, and that Neanderthals' brains simply prevented them from having that particular capability. But the point is that along with these unique capacities that we have as human beings, our brain anatomy seems to correlate with those capabilities and is also the basis for human beings being viewed as unique. And it turns out that this globular skull appears about 130,000 years ago in the fossil record. That's when we first see very clear evidence for this globular skull. Now, what's also interesting is the archaeological record seems to also indicate that the appearance of symbolism in the archaeological record shows up pretty close to the time that the globular skull appears. That as it turns out, in recent years, archaeologists have discovered art in a number of cave systems throughout Southeast Asia. And that in some of these instances, this cave art, which is virtually identical to the cave art that we see in Europe that appears about 40,000 years ago, it's virtually identical, but it's actually older. The cave art in Asia is actually older than the cave art that we see in Europe, which means that before humans began to migrate around the world, we must have had this capacity for artistic expression. And art is a representation of symbolism. So because language isn't going to preserve in the archaeological record, art becomes a proxy for human language. Christopher Stringer says this: it's a really important find. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there 60,000 years ago. It may have even been there in Africa before 60,000 years ago, and it spread with modern humans. In line with this, we have now evidence for symbolism in coastal caves in South Africa. And interestingly enough, Miyagawa, who's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at MIT, argues that this capacity for symbolism probably existed in humans even earlier than 100,000 years ago. So in other words, what we're seeing here is that there seems to be this confluence of the emergence of symbolism with the emergence of the globular skull, right? And again, what makes us unique and distinct from a scientific perspective ultimately centers around our symbolic capabilities. It's what gives us that capacity to communicate with language, with music, with art. It gives us the capacity to develop narratives and to engage in mental time travel. Now, so in other words, we can make an argument that humans are exceptional, that humans are unique, that we're different in kind, and that we can, again, connect it to the scientific concept of the Imago Dei. But then what about Neanderthals, right? Because isn't there this claim that Neanderthals were like us? Well, as I've already pointed out, there is a difference in the brain structure between Neanderthals and modern humans. And that difference in brain structure is such that you would think that Neanderthals are cognitively inferior to modern humans. And in addition to that, there's data that I'm not going to talk about from genetics and from other types of experiments that, again, reinforce this notion that Neanderthals were probably not like us in terms of their cognitive capacities. But again, you still have this archaeological record that seemingly indicates that Neanderthals were capable of all these very interesting capabilities. Well, I'll point this out, that every one of these claims is disputed. That if you look at the science in the news, the popular scientific communications, invariably they make the point for Neanderthal exceptionalism, that Neanderthals were like us. But if you actually go into the scientific literature, every one of these claims is challenged by other scientific studies. So the best you can say is that it's in dispute in terms of whether Neanderthals are like us or not. There are two groups of anthropologists. One group gets a lot of publicity for their views, that view of Neanderthal exceptionalism. The other group's work sits quietly in the scientific literature, but is a direct challenge to the claim of Neanderthal exceptionalism. Now, to me, what seals the deal that modern humans are unique compared to Neanderthals is the trajectory of our technologies. Neanderthals are on Earth longer than humans have been on Earth, modern humans, and their technology was static. Modern humans appear on the scene and our technology was primitive, but within a relatively short period of time, our technology explodes. This is what Ian Tattersall, Noam Chomsky, and other co-authors say about the trajectory of human technology. Our species was born in a technologically archaic context, and significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinct species, but it was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. This stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. And so why is there a difference in the trajectory between Neanderthal technology and human technology? There's got to be something different about us. And that difference means that human beings really do stand apart from Neanderthals. We're different in kind. Well, now, what about animal intelligence? Because again, animals are doing some remarkable things, right? They are capable of doing sophisticated problem solving. They display this emotional richness where they mourn the loss of members of their group. They clearly form bonds with other members of their group, deep, abiding bonds. Well, as remarkable as animals may be, it's quite reasonable to think that what animals are doing when they solve problems is fundamentally different than what we do as humans when we solve problems. Because remember, our capacity to solve problems is largely connected to our ability to do mental time travel. With animals, there's a growing view that their capacity to solve problems actually is due to associative learning, right? Associative learning is this idea of connected with Pavlov, right? That if there is a behavior and then there is a reward, that reward is going to reinforce the behavior. If there's behavior and there's punishment, that punishment is going to discourage the behavior. And animals have working memory. In other words, they can remember the past. And so because of that, they can actually daisy chain together sequences of behavioral sequences. And if there is a reward, that not only reinforces the immediate behavior, but subsequent behaviors as well that led up to that ultimate reward. And because of this, through associative learning, animals can learn to develop very sophisticated problem-solving abilities in order to get the rewards. And they can also avoid behaviors to avoid punishment. Now, it turns out that this type of associative learning is the very type of learning that AI systems engage in. It's machine learning, it's all associative learning, where when you train an AI system, you are scoring the output. If you give it a high score, that's a reward. If you give it a low score, that is a punishment. And so the learning that AI systems do is fundamentally associative learning, and AI systems can do rather sophisticated things. So why would we not expect the same thing with animals? In other words, what they're engaged in is something fundamentally different in terms of the way humans reason. Johann Lind, who's one of the scientists who's advocating this perspective, said this: associative learning is an underestimated general mechanism that can account for a large array of behavioral phenomena observed in animals. Now, one thing that we've got to be careful about is anthropomorphism. And what I mean by that is that as humans, we tend to attribute human qualities and human motives to animals and inanimate objects, right? And this is actually due to our theory of mind. Because we have theory of mind, where we recognize that others have minds like ours and they think like we do, they reason like we do, they have the same motivations we do, we understand their feelings, their emotions. We not only apply that to other humans, but we can't turn it off. We apply it to animals, we apply it to machines. And so when we see an animal engaged in a behavior, we tend to attribute human motives, human thinking, human reasoning to that animal, when in fact it may be functioning very different than we are at a fundamental level. And in fact, this problem with anthropomorphism actually influences the way people interpret animal behavioral studies. And this is not my perspective, but the perspective of Miriam Stamp Dawkins, who's an animal behavioralist and who was actually Richard Dawkins' first wife. She wrote a book, Why Animals Matter, where she makes this very point about anthropomorphism. Thomas Suddendorf makes a similar point in the book, The Gap, where he argues, look, animals do remarkable things. They communicate, but their communication is fundamentally different than our ability to communicate, which is based on open-ended human language. Animals have memory, but we uniquely are engaged in mental time travel. Animals may have social cognition, but we have theory of mind. Animals solve problems. We are capable of abstract reasoning. Animals have social tradition. We have cumulative culture. Animals may have empathy. We have morality. Nathan Lentz, interestingly enough, even though he argues that animals are very much like us, that we really are not that different from other animals, or other animals are not that different from us, makes this interesting statement. He says, I think both humans and chimpanzees feel love. The only difference is that humans write sonnets about it. Well, that ability to write sonnets reflects a fundamentally distinct capacity that humans have. Right? He says, I think both humans and dolphins practice fair play, but only humans enact laws to govern it. Well, the capacity to produce laws to govern our behavior says that what we're doing is going far beyond fair play. We're enacting ethical and moral systems And that capacity to produce laws reflects a fundamentally different capacity that humans have. Elephants experience grief, but only humans seek professional counseling to cope with it. Well, then what about AI systems? Well, as we've already made mention, AI systems are based on machine learning. This is associative learning. And these are very sophisticated programs that are not thinking like us, that are not functioning like us, that probably will never have truly self-awareness or sentience. But they could very well be programmed in such a way to appear to have sentience, to appear to have self-awareness, to appear to be like us, to appear to have human emotions. But this is how they are programmed. But that programming is still fundamentally based on machine learning. It's not based on what we're capable of doing, which is mental time travel. So the bottom line is this idea of the image of God, which is the heart of Christian ethics. It's the heart of the gospel. We can enter into a relationship with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, mediated by the work of Christ on the cross, because we bear God's image. Because we bear God's image, every human being has infinite worth and value, is the object of God's love. This theological idea that is so critical, that is the basis for why we think humans are exceptional and unique from a Christian worldview perspective, is an idea that we can actually defend scientifically thanks to the insights that are happening regarding the scientific case for human exceptionalism and the basis for our exceptional nature. So we can hold to this idea of the image of God in the age of AI and in the age of Darwin.